Right. Welcome back, everyone. We're doing a little bit more of an interesting, exciting one. We got a guest on here, Bella, a friend of ours from Lifesaving and just general mutual friend. She has to do something for her school, and so we decided, obviously, since we're such giving people, we'll help out.
So generous.
So generous. What we're going to discuss today is poverty. What is your responsibility as the individual? Is there any responsibility? And as a global thing, what is a global responsibility to solve poverty? Kind of general discussion point.
So to solve global poverty as opposed to like poverty in your area as well as all over the world, right?
Yeah.
Including everything.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. How's it better?
I am excited to be on the podcast today, and I think these are important issues.
Fantastic. So why don't you start us off with what you're kind of thinking with regards to what is global poverty and then the topics that we discussed.
Yeah, so I think it's an interesting and difficult problem to solve because it's not like, okay, like there's no poverty in the developed world, like that it's just in the developing world. Like there's poverty in every single country. Like in the United States, you still have people who are living below the poverty line, but then you maybe have like a larger percentage of people living below the poverty line in South Africa. And does that mean like there's one solution to solve this huge complex problem? And I think there's an argument to be made for local solutions to local problems. For example, I was thinking of the case of South Africa. Like we have a history of apartheid, which was systemic oppression, which meant that people of color have been economically and socially disenfranchised for so many years. And tackling this is going to be very different to tackling poverty in Indonesia, where the history is very different. And it could be problematic if we tried to like kind of have like a one fix solution that doesn't understand these like nuances in the reasons behind the problem.
Yeah. I agree. I think that is important to kind of have a localized view, because obviously every society is different and has a different history and whatever, like you're saying. I was thinking it'd be interesting for us to start wondering about like responsibility, like looking at different organizations and being like, where does the burden of responsibility fall? Like between these organizations, like obviously individual citizens are a part of each organization, right? But to what extent does the organization itself as its own entity take on that responsibility as opposed to the individual? So like how much responsibility do local governments have, their national governments, and then like, you know, like UN type international governing bodies, and then like also NGOs that are not related to government and do work against poverty and that type of stuff. Like where does the burden of responsibility, where does the biggest chunk fall?
I think inside of that, understanding obviously that firstly, I mean, like you said, one of the biggest things to come to terms with is the fact that there's different kinds everywhere. Like the nature of poverty is different in all the different places because the nature of the organizations who are going to be solving the problem is different in all those situations. So, which basically means the solution is different throughout everything. And so when defining responsibility, it's like, it's not always a fiscal responsibility, and it's not always a logistical responsibility because or infrastructural, while like in the States, like you mentioned, while there is good infrastructure, there still lies the poverty, and that can be because of the old civil rights movement, and there can be still oppression in certain areas. And so the nature of the problem of poverty is different I think in obviously globally. And I think the important thing is come to the terms with a mental framework for understanding the responsibility of how to solve the solution. So which first comes from understanding what is the nature of the problem, which is then more than anything engagement with the local communities, and inside of that assessing situation. in order to gain. So that's the kind of mentality I'm coming from when we talk about responsibilities. That's kind of what I'm thinking. I don't know if that makes sense or not.
Yeah,
okay,
I think.
Yeah, you go ahead, Bella.
Yeah, I think that an interesting point was brought up on, where does the burden of this responsibility lie? And then also, how do we like define this responsibility? And I was wondering what you guys were thinking. Like, is it that, like organizations like within a specific country have responsibility to the citizens of that country? Or do we all have a responsibility to help, like who do we help first? Like, is it the people nearest to us, or is it the least well off in the whole world? Like, do we go and find those people who like have the least amount of money and help them first? I'm not sure like what strategy we'd have for like categorizing who we help first.
Well, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a hard question. I think I'm still going to stand by my original point of, if we're helping those nearby us, we're going to have more insight into the problem and then understand how to help the problem. But I think this can also be a dangerous view to have, because it kind of like puts the burden away from countries that might have caused the problem. Like, I'm just thinking of like examples of colonization who have led, have caused like really big issues in some poorer countries. And if we like follow through with my view, those countries might not feel obliged to, help the poor in those countries they have affected. And maybe they do have a responsibility towards those countries.
Right. So yeah, I think that's a super important point. Is I think naturally, like from a practical perspective, you want to just like literally help. You want to help like the person who's like begs on your street, or like at the closest robots, or the person outside of your work. You want to like try uplift them in a meaningful way, if possible, if you have those means or whatever. That's like practically you're like, okay, well, that's what I can do personally, and even like join local organizations or whatever. That's the first practical step. But it is super important to remember that there's some similarities globally, or I think there's a core similarity globally. And like what causes poverty, right? In my view, what causes poverty is the maldistribution of resources. So like there's enough of everything for everyone in the world.
Yeah.
That's just a mathematical fact. Like there's enough food, water, housing, and all the other stuff we need, the basics, for no person to have to live below the poverty line, right? There's even enough work to be done for every person to have a job like and live a meaningful life. But for some reason, that's not the case. And like we've been saying, it's a global problem, right? Now, why does that exist? And I think that's important when we start to ask ourselves, like, how much responsibility do we have in the rest of the world? And I think that means there's some level of poverty that's systemic. So there's a global system. There's something about the world and the systems we use globally that result in this problem of people not having enough to survive. And although I think we have to tackle that on a macro level, like, and look at it big picture. It's hard to like do that and then like ignore the problems on your doorstep as well. So I think it is tough to go in between. Yeah, what are you going to say, Luke?
I'm a little bit undereducated in poverty in general, but I think one of the biggest things to find out whether is poverty growing, and then if so, what is causing the growth? Because what it could just be is that we're seeing the ramifications of colonization, especially in Africa, and then the ramifications of historical issues. And if that's the case, then the first responsibility is, okay, cool, we need to make extreme societal change, which then it means because we have the infrastructure, we have the jobs, we have the resources. But now what inside of our society is not allowing those resources to flow to the people who need them most? Is it a conceptual issue of an ideology where people are like, oh no, but we don't need to do that, or we shouldn't do that? Because logically it makes sense to provide enough food for everyone to survive. But the issue is that we're not. And so we're in the breakdown of, okay, cool, we have all these resources, why isn't it being distributed effectively? And does that fall on the ownership of individual people producing resources, or should it be the government that oversees the fact that there's a large amount of resources and then distributes them according to agreed upon societal issues, and then our responsibility as individuals in society is to agree that there are people who need it more than us, and then resources would then be allocated should we have the ability to provide for ourselves. Does that make sense? Where we then the responsibility, because this is the issue that I have with the idea of, okay, cool, help the guy on your street, is the fact that if we're going to solve a systemic issue, it needs to be, everything needs to be correlated or organized in steps in order to solve the problem. Because if I'm driving down the road and I toss my 10 Rand out to the guy at the robot, so I'm like, no, cool, I'm solving poverty. You know, he's got a little money. Am I solving poverty, or am I just am I just doing something that makes me feel better?
No, I think that's an important distinction to make. Charity is not solving poverty. There's almost no charity that does anything to solve poverty. Charities almost always just make people's lives a little bit more bearable. So the best type of charities are the ones that make people's lives slightly more bearable. Other charities don't do much at all. I'm very critical of charity work for that reason, because charities don't ask for systemic changes. They're like, it's like, you know, you plug in, you put your finger in the dike type thing, you know, you plug in holes. You're not like solving the problem of like, why is it leaking? Like, so I think that's super important. Like, if you are someone who thinks that giving a guy a robot in South Africa 10 Rand is like some sort of social change, like, you need to understand that that's not the case. You've made that guy's day 100%. That person's like stoked, they're happy, but you've made no systemic changes. And I think in terms of solving, like, it's hard to say solve poverty. It's such like it's like almost too much of a big concept. But to solve an issue this big, there has to be global systemic change. So yeah, I think that's an important distinction. It's like, when you talk about local organizations, I would argue it's like the ones that are like, for example, in Cape Town, you have Reclaim the City, which is an organization that fights against the city selling off public land for development, as opposed to like creating something that serves lower income people or like the rest of the community. So like, that's a local organization fighting on a systemic level type thing, you know. That's kind of my perspective on actual change happening.
Yeah, I think it's important. I think systems definitely will have to be changed if this issue is like ever going to be solved, and not just like patched up like you were saying. But I think it's important to remember, like, if we shift all of our energy away from like charities who are helping these people just kind of like get food every day, like put food into their mouths, and we shift to advocacy, which is also really important. Like, are we willing to make that compromise where a whole generation of the poor suffers? We're redirecting our efforts. Like, in the long term, do you guys think that the systemic change would be worth compromising
I don't
the help we're already giving to the poor? That's
I don't
that's a good question.
I don't think charity necessarily needs to be done away with, because I think within its own bubble, I think there's room for charity. I just think it's the way we look at this problem needs to change. It's the fact that we often, and it's a characteristic of capitalist societies, is that we always look towards the top achievers in our community, and we're like, okay, cool, look at how well they're doing, so obviously our country's doing great. But I think the real change happens when we start to judge ourselves by the bottom percentage or the bottom percentile, where we're like, hey, there's people who don't have toilets. You know, how can we like congratulate ourselves for like getting 3 medals at the Olympics and like arbitrary like gains or qualifications when there's there's actual humanity issues inside, because that's what poverty is. It's a humanitarian problem.
Yeah.
You know, there's a bunch of people that were lucky enough to get homes and warmth, and then there's a bunch of people who aren't. And so, and I mean, luck is a bad word to use, but the point is that when will we start judging ourselves on the fact that there's people who don't live like us, and how can we solve that systemically? And I think that if that means instead of giving 10 Rand every 2 weeks to a shopping person, I pay 10 Rand a day, and that goes to the country, then distributed, or, you know, there's actual change made. And it's going to take a lot of very talented, skilled, dedicated people, and an administration that can organize that into an effective use. And the biggest thing that's been a problem in history is the fact that whenever you have a conversation about one place to create change, everyone's like, okay, cool, but then I don't want my money going to someone else, you know, and then it's the corruption.
I disagree. I don't think it's a logistical nightmare. I don't think it's gonna take a whole lot of brilliant people to solve. It's not complicated at all. If we change our personal perspective of the world from like this egocentric me perspective that a large part of the people who live above the poverty line have in the world, then I think that changes it. So I think that's the burden of personal responsibility for me, is personal ideological change, like not being scared of the system changing because it's going to affect your life, right? But I think the real burden, in my opinion, and this is maybe something that people would expect me to say, I don't know, but is that the responsibility really falls on the people who have serious influence in the world. So government officials and yes, all those people, but the people making gross amounts of money that no one needs, right? The fact that Bill Gates gives away, it's like a fun fact. Bill Gates gives away half of all the money he makes. You're like, well done, Bill. Like, you like giving all your money to malaria crisis. Like, that's great. Like, literally saving lives. People are getting malaria pills from Bill Gates. It's great. But he doesn't, but people like that who are doing this type of charitable work, and it's literally helping people's lives, but they're not influenced, but they're not influencing any type of policy. So like the imperialist actions of the United States have resulted in increased poverty in Africa, the Middle East, like all over the world, so the Philippines, and that is directly as a result of US political actions. People are living in like worse poverty than ever as a result of like US political actions, and the people with influence aren't holding their own governments like responsible for this type of thing, right? So like I can shout as much as I want and be like, South African government, like you need to do more, like do this and that, like, and I wish I was listened to, but some of us have less of a voice than others. So people with a voice should be putting pressure on the people who are actually responsible for policy change in the world. So that's like national governments, the UN, other big governing organs. They need to hear from like influential people that there needs to be systemic change, as opposed to them being like, I'll buy like 1 million malaria pills, like, you know, for actual change. Yeah. Anyway, that's my.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And then the question kind of comes in, like, how do you get these people with influence to advocate for policy change? And I think then it's like, it is easy to say like, oh, well, those people like need to take responsibility, but I could be an argument to be made that like these people are all selling things to consumers. So consumers do have the power to mobilize and like put pressure on these influential people to do what we want. But I think the problem comes in is like, how do you get all these people to mobilize? And if people are like suffering from poverty and just focusing on getting their families fed and living from day to day, like
Yeah.
do they have the time and resources to engage in such like advocacy, putting on pressure? So then responsibility is put on the middle class people who kind of do have spare resources to be able to engage with that. But how do we get everyone to buy into that?
Right. Yeah, that's true. I think a lot of people struggle. Like a lot of people who aren't in poverty are still struggling, just like maybe their job takes up most of their free time, or when they do like live their lives, as in like look after their kids, or like, you know, so like what the current system holds those people back from being involved in any case.
Yeah.
So like that type of systematic change will help solve poverty and redistribution of wealth. Is like allowing workers and people who are like at the moment like gridlocked in like day-to-day activities to be able to like have a view outside of their own responsibilities, because at the moment their responsibilities, which they're able to take care of, envelop their whole lives, and that's understandable. Like I don't expect anyone who works 5 to 6 days a week, 10 hours a day to have, I think they shouldn't be thinking about charity or anything like that. Like don't like get your own life in order first. I absolutely think that's important. Like your own mental health, your own kids' lives, whatever, that comes first.
I think inside of that there's very difficult but important decisions to make. And I say difficult not in the sense that we don't know what we're trying to accomplish. The difficult thing is making effective policy decisions that make the outcome we want. Because we know what we want, but the difficulty is then creating actual structure in place that can then funnel those things down. Because it's not as simple as just saying, okay, cool, everyone, we're gonna move resources this way, and it's gonna work out. You know, I mean, like you say, I mean, we're in a privileged position to be able to have this discussion, have enough free time to have these kind of thoughts. You know,
Right.
that's not a lot of people have this. You know, we're a part of the few. The thing is that then how do we then have this educational kind of thing through society where everyone kind of picks up the social burden of being like, okay, cool, I need to help the guy next to me. And I think the way I think social media is, I mean, we see like there's movements like, you know, the Occupy in Wall Street and then also in London, where we have these massive movements that move on social media and then cause change. And I think the real flip side of that is when we all have voices and just carrying on moving in that direction of, okay, cool, instead of just making a hashtag, what is the practical implication? What do you actually go, where's this discussion going to happen? So how do we encourage the collective gathering of people in a productive manner to pull resource, you know? And it doesn't need to be physical. When I say gathering, I mean, it could be just people agreeing that certain things need to be done differently. And I think, and then that boils down to the local level. But I think all of this only ever starts, and I'm going to come back to the thing of people need to understand that you're only as good as the bottom part of the people in your group, you know? It's like the whole thing is like you're only as fast as the slowest person. So the thing is we're only as good as the people who don't have water, the people who don't get to eat, the people who don't have internet. And when everyone really understands the implications of that, and just get people to a base level. Like you don't even need to be that. You don't need to have a 5-bedroom home or, you know, a 3-bedroom. You need to have a home with running. You know, that kind of mentality where it's just practical for Martin and East to build homes. You know, it's practical to get, you know, infrastructure in there.
Yeah.
And it's the importance of good policy, and then the consumer who's educated, passionate, and yeah, those are the two. To bring about change in everyday life, because it's not as easy as being like, okay, cool. Yeah, we all agree that there's a problem. It's going to be extreme. Everyone involved in agreeing that is going to actually have to make a step in the right direction, kind of thing.
Yeah. So you're saying like there's talking about responsibility, that every single person has a role to play.
Yeah,
And it may be a slightly different role depending on
I mean,
your
it's
influence and whatever.
almost guaranteed to be a different role.
Right.
I mean, the nature of there's like, that's the thing. Like, even your Bill Gates example is perfect. Is that yes, Bill Gates has millions and billions of dollars, you know, and because of that, we all are like, no, he has to do more. Like, you know, that's
well, I don't want him to do more. I want him
Yeah.
to do something different.
Yeah.
You know, like Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos will basically Jeff Bezos. Something else. But yeah.
It's arbitrary. The billionaire who we're discussing is arbitrary. The fact is that when you have a large pool of resources, you're expected by everyone else to do more. And I think that's basically what we're saying. And then basically then the billionaires, then we just all should expect them to do more. And inside of that, you only understand if you have a little bit more than someone else, it's not bad for you to be expected to do more. You know, you shouldn't have your pool and be like, oh my goodness, like, you know, and feel attacked. It's like, well, it's the same way you're looking at someone else doing the same thing. You know, so it's the understanding that it's everyone's responsibility, and you know, and we can point fingers at people above us all day, but you know, you must remember that we're.
Can I make a local suggestion in terms of like something practical there?
So, are you listening?
Yeah, please imagine. Because I feel like even though Cyril's become this, well, he became this businessman, capitalist goon, there's something genuine that sits inside him. I can feel it. There's something there. Anyway, that's just fantasy for me. But like, so this now is you're like Martin East, okay, big civil engineering company. They got a lot of government tenders. They got a lot of private tenders to build like all these things, and you're like, why don't they build like low income housing, something like that, right? As like pro bono. Now, that's where I truly believe the South African government like is probably one of the few governments in the world that has the like nerve to put something like this in place, because we're not super neoliberal. We still have a lot of government involvement in South Africa, which, in my opinion, is good at this point. So, like, it's the type of government that needs to put together programs where, like, there's government tenders where companies that make over a certain amount of turnover a year have to do those tenders for free, not for free, but like as a service to the country. They get paid. They don't make a loss, but they only charge like cost price. You're not allowed to make profit on those projects, and the government pays for the resources and whatever, but the company's not allowed to like mark that up.
Yeah.
So they run programs like that to build housing, etc. There's so many socio-economic problems that come with government housing, though. So let's just ignore those for now.
Yeah.
But that type of thing, and then it doesn't have to be with housing only, it can be with a whole lot of stuff. So where there's like government policy where if you have a certain number of tenders or the amount of money you make from government tenders is high enough, then you should be doing that for free as well. And for that, there has to be a buy-in from the haves. So the people who sit on boards and
Mr. Martin, Mr. E.
all those things, right? Those people have a responsibility. Well, we have to get them on board.
Yeah.
The government can't be like, you have to do this. And then they're like, no. And then it becomes a court case. Like, that's pointless.
Yeah.
You know, we need to all like be like, okay, this is a good way to like move things forward. That would be my like local suggestion.
What do you think, Bella?
Yeah, I like that suggestion. Do you think, I was just thinking like it works really well for like, you know, like building companies or like, I don't know, companies that print textbooks or something. But what about companies that their service isn't necessarily something that's like needed by the masses or needed for like, would you still tax, because this sounds kind of like you're taxing them in the form of like providing their services pro bono, which I think is like quite a like unique idea that I haven't heard before. But I'm wondering if like, I don't know, what if there was like a company that online games, like that's like, sure, we give people free on games, but is that really helping anyone?
I think the way it's not as one dimensional as that. It's just because like for instance, just because there's an IT company doesn't mean the IT company doesn't have the resources within it to be useful. Because inside of that IT company is talented people that have the skills to solve problems, and yes, they've been using it in an IT context, but I don't see why there's any way of an IT company not pooling its resources to come up with a ID books to be generous, silly examples of things like that, but there's something valuable in any company which is just a group of people.
Yeah, any successful
company has talented people inside of it, whether a marketing company for generating educational pamphlets or a videography company for creating similar video things, whatever. But inside of every group, there's a talented group of people, and if we can tax the talent in a country, no, that's kind of nice term. But we can tax the talent, inverted commas, and use skills that we have inside of us as a society to solve the problems that need to be solved. Then I think, because business is just solving problems in order to increase profit. Right. Government is just solving problems in order to increase standard living or GDP or however you measure it. So we're always solving problems. It's just, can we solve the right problem? And inside of that, I think the whole stuff is. But we actually had a chat about the kind of a civil service, inverted commas, that this could potentially happen the other day. But we'll go into that. But yeah, I think taxing businesses is more complex than what the business does. And I think that's the important conversation to have inside of this, is that we each as individuals bring something to the table, and it's almost up to the individual to understand what that is,
Yeah, I like that. It's kind of like making sure that like every company kind of has like a social good program, and they can like kind of decide how they can best use the skills and resources they have to help people, but everyone should have to do it. So making an amount of money.
Yeah. I mean, and just from another, probably going to make more money anyway if you do it, because with the more social interaction, it just makes more sense that when we have a more interconnected society, it's just better. So I see it's a win-win, but it's a conceptual change, and people just don't like changing their minds when they think they know the answer. And I think that's the real battle at the end of the day, is an educational one.
Yeah, information-based. I think the important thing to note is that, like in South Africa, there is pretty good corporate rules in terms of that companies have to give back to society. So, and it's like quite well encouraged. So like you get tax breaks and stuff for, like doing certain things or like contributing money to certain organizations and stuff. So like Euroskill is a good example. In paddling, they pretty much fund South African paddling now, singularly. Yeah. And that's all because they get super good tax incentives from it, and that's all great. Like, I think they've done an incredible job of like uplifting non-white paddlers in South Africa. It's been like one of the more successful programs, even though there's been other really successful programs, like Martin Dreyer ran one, and then Brad Fisher ran one as well in Joburg. But like in a modern sense, they've done that. I just don't think they should be getting incredible tax breaks. I think they should be doing that anyway. I think it's just, if you make a lot of money, you've got a responsibility to like give back, and not necessarily like pump money in. Like you say, like use the human resources you have. And like, imagine you work for a steel company, like doing accounting for a steel company, and your job's super boring, but then like 3 or 4 days a month, you work on like this like a social project of some sort that you can literally see as helping people, the kind of like spiritual even upliftment you get as a person is like large, and that's beneficial to the company anyway, to have employees feeling like they're like involved in something bigger.
Yeah.
You know, so I think there's a lot to be like said about human resources and stuff like that. No. A little bit of a slow connection.
Yeah, I think we touched on quite a bit there. Bella, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think we've come to like a slight, like definitely we haven't solved global poverty in having this discussion, but we've come to a solution that could be implemented locally, which I think needs to be considered. So I hope important people are listening to this conversation.
They're not.
And I think it's really good, like the point that they're not. No, I think it's really good the point you brought up, Shanti, about we should also consider how this is going to like encourage like the people working on these projects and make them feel better and make them feel uplifted by helping other people. Because I think we were just kind of focusing before on like the costs, like the financial cost to things. And I think like people's like emotional and like spiritual feelings are also really good to consider. So I'm glad we got to touch on that in our conversation.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Bella. I don't know if there's anything you want to say in closing, but I think we touched on everything. I think that was very insightful. I'm glad we mostly agree on everything.
We don't want to get so far along the conversation that we actually start to solve problems.
We're just here to call them out.
Otherwise, then we're not philosophers anymore.
No. So. We're just here to tell people what the problems are, never to solve it.
No, thank you guys. This has been really great, and thank you for having me as a guest.
Absolutely.
That was great. Thanks for the awesome topic idea and being such a great guest. The first guest, actually.
First guest ever. Oh, cool. If you want to be a guest,
wow, I'm so honored.
Send us an email.
Send us an email or DM us. Okay, cool. Ciao, Bella. Have a good one. And stay safe, eh?
Bye, guys.